In this new series of videos, we're going to discuss the basics of animation within Maya. And we're going to be creating a project in which we're going to have a really basic mechanical arm that has a cyclical animation of pretty much picking up an object and going back to its default position. Alright? And within this project, we're going to discuss concepts of basically how important the location of your pivots are, parenting, constraining, and perhaps some special controls. We're also going to be covering, how do you create anticipation and follow through by using the curve editor. But for now, I want to stick to just kind of introducing you to basically some of the basic things that you need to know as far as the viewport within Maya as far as animation. So let's start with some basics. I want to create a project where I basically have, let's just create a plane here. Alright, so I want to have this plane here, and I'm going to have a sphere kind of jumping from one side to the other one, okay? And I'm basically just going to be using a sphere here, okay? And the size is pretty much going to be arbitrary here. I'm just going to go here into my left viewport, and I'm just going to move it so it's resting on the plane, okay? Let's just display my grid here. Okay, this dark black line is basically at 0 here, so just gonna move it up and just set it there. And then I'm just gonna go back into my viewport, into my perspective. Sorry, kind of move it back a bit. Turn off my grid. All right. So before I start my animation here, I want to kind of set up a couple things within my preferences to make sure that everything kind of works out well for me here. So I'm going to go into Window, and I'm going to go into Preferences. Alright. Now the first thing that I want to look into is in my settings here. Always make sure that you're using the right units for your project. In this instance, going to be feet for me. By default, Maya uses millimeters, so just make sure you change this to whatever it is that you want your project to be set at. The next thing I want to make sure is that I'm using under time, I'm using 24 frames per second. Alright. Again, this is kind of what's used in film, so this is what I'm going to stick with in this project. Now, if you are familiar with the curve editor, you might want to change the type of tangents that you're kind of creating with your animation. But at this point for this introduction, we're not going to really talk about this. So the last thing I want to change is to under settings, go under time slider. And under playback, I want to make sure that the playback speed is at real time 24 frames per second. Alright. Now the reason for this is because if we don't have it at real time, when we play back our animation, it's going to be really fast. Okay. So we want to make sure there's a real time 24 frames per second. And then I'm going to click on save here just to kind of save those settings so we can start. Okay. Now, before we create any animation here for our sphere, you need to be familiar with the time slider. Okay, this is basically where our keyframes are going to be set up. All right. So this timeline basically determines where in time the certain part of the animation is going to be at. All right, and here's where you're going to be seeing your keyframes as well. The time range pretty much determines what range of your timeline you're looking at. So you can always by clicking on the boxes here at the corners, you can always kind of change that depending on what you're trying to do. For instance, if you're trying to get really close to a couple keyframes that you have between 11 and 19, this is how you would do it. If you don't want to bother with using this, you can always set up the numbers with the first two boxes that you got here. So this first one right here determines where the timeline kind of starts. So I believe by default it's 1, but you can change it to whatever you want. So if I wanted to start at 5, my timeline would start at 5. All right, or at least the range of it would if I change this. The second one right here determines where the range ends. Okay, so if this is 5 and this says 41, my time range is going to be between 5 and 41. The other two extremes determine how big our timeline is. So this one determines exactly what it starts and exactly where it ends. So based on what we have here, our timeline starts at 0 and ends at 48 frames. So the range here is pretty much between it's determined by basically how many frames we have between this number and this one. So having from 0 to 48, we're determining that our range is between 5 and 41 right now. But if we wanted to have a full range of the whole line, I could always drag this to 0 and this to 41 or 48, sorry, which is how much we have here. But for now, my time range, I'm just going to leave it to between 0 and 24 frames. Okay. The next thing that you want to keep in mind is our playback settings. Okay, and we're going to be covering this as we're working on the animation. So let's just go ahead and begin, and then we'll cover some of these playback settings. Now, the animation that I want to create is basically a sphere that just kind of bounces from one place to the other corner. Okay, so first thing that I want to do is set up a keyframe where it's located. Alright, so the shortcut for you to create animation is the letter S. When you click on the letter S, you're going to see two things. The boxes in our channel box here are going to be turned red. This means that a keyframe has been assigned to all of these attributes. Okay, and you're also going to see a red line on our timeline. Okay, so this determines, or what this shows you is that at this point, at 0 in your timeline, there has been a keyframe set up for all of these attributes. Okay, now if I wanted my sphere to move from one section to another one, I would have to go to another point in my timeline, in this case 24, make a change in my viewport. In this case is going to be moving forward. Alright, and you need to set a keyframe, otherwise the change that we created doesn't count. Alright, so if I were to go back to the beginning here, okay, and I can use my playback settings here, this one right here is going to take me to the start of the timeline, and this one's going to take me to the end. So at this point, I want to go back to the beginning, so I'm just going to click on this one. Okay, and if I want to play this animation forward, I'm going to click on this one right here, which is the play forwards. Okay, now notice that nothing's happening, and the reason for that is because we were at the beginning here. Alright, then we went at the end here, right? So I'm just going to click on the other extreme, which takes me to the end of my timeline. I make the movement, but notice that no keyframe was set up for this movement. So if there isn't any keyframe, there isn't an animation. So in order to make sure that this movement was recorded, you need to make sure you set a keyframe. So I'm just going to press S again. Alright, so I'm going to go back to the beginning of my timeline again by pressing the Go Start to Playback range, which is this one, and then I'm going to press play, so it shows me the whole timeline that I created, of the whole animation in this timeline. Alright, so I just created a sphere kind of moving forward. Now let's look at the rest of the settings here. Now there's a couple ways that you can move around your timeline here. Alright, I'm about to cover basically every single one here in the playback, but just know that just by left clicking on the timeline on specific keyframes, you will move to that specific keyframe. Alright, you can also left click and just drag, and it'll also you can also kind of move around your timeline like this. Alright, so this one takes you to the start, this one to the end. Okay, this one allows you to go backwards frame by frame. Alright, this one allows you to go backwards between frames. So if I want to go back, instead of one frame, I want to go back to the last keyframe that's on my timeline, I would just click on this one. It'll take me to the beginning because that's where the last keyframe is. This one, it'll play backwards. Okay, this one will play forward, and again you can kind of click on the red stop to stop this. Alright, this one would allow you to go forward to the next keyframe, which is right here at the end. Alright, this one allows you to move forward keyframe by keyframe. Sorry, number by number, not necessarily keyframe by keyframe. And then this one takes you to the end. Alright. Alright, so let's just go back to the start again. And again, this is the animation that we just created. Now, the next thing I want to do is go into frame 12 here. I want to create the movement of my sphere kind of going up in an arc. Okay? Because again, it's supposed to be bouncing from one spot to another one. So, to do this, I can do one of two things. I can move it up, alright, and then press on S, and it'll set a keyframe for me. So if I go back to the beginning of my timeline, I can press play and it's doing this. Alright, the other way that I can do this is by using my AutoKey. The AutoKey, it's a function in Maya that allows you to create keyframes without you having to press on the shortcut S to create the keyframes. Alright, so basically all I have to do is click on this key right here that's under my playback. Alright, and again, you know it's turned on when it's red, and then I'm just going to move on the Y up. Okay, now when I let go of my move Y over here, you're going to notice a couple things. A keyframe was created at 12, alright, but then the other thing that you should notice is that only the Y attribute here is the only one that's changed. Alright, so that means that it only set a keyframe for this and nothing else. And again, this is going to come into play later, but what you should keep in mind is that I created a keyframe without me having to press S on the object to key everything. It just it created the keyframe for me by just creating the movement. Now, the AutoKey only works if there is a keyframe previously set for the object. So the only reason why it set a keyframe for me is because we already created keyframes for the beginning and the end. If I didn't have a keyframe and I had my AutoKey on, it wouldn't set any keyframes to this object. So if I play this back to the beginning, okay, you're going to notice that it's going to go kind of side to side over here. Alright, perfect. The next thing I want to do is maybe give it a little bit, more appeal by maybe giving it a little bit, by applying the principles of animations, maybe applying a little bit of squash and stretch and anticipation or something like that. Now that's not going to be visible if we just leave it like this. I want to maybe assign a texture to make it easy for me to see this. So by right clicking on the object, I'm going to go to assign new material. Alright, and I'm just going to give it a blend. Alright, and then this material and this blend that I just created, I'm going to go into the color and I'm just going to assign one of these default materials that come, this procedural default materials that come within Maya. And again, my computer's being a little slow here. Alright, so one of these is this checker. Okay, so I'm just going to click on it. You're not going to be able to see anything in the viewport. Okay, there it is. Alright, so this is what we have so far. Alright, so the next thing that I want to do is create, again, a little bit of anticipation and a little bit of maybe follow through and things like that. I want to keep my animation just at 1 second or 24 frames. So one of the things that I need to do with my keyframes is kind of be able to move them around a little bit, just to kind of get my timing a little bit better. So if you already created keyframes in your timeline and you want to either delete them or move them around, there's a couple of things that you can do. If you click on the timeline, this darker gray area means that's where it's you're kind of selecting, alright, or where you currently are in your timeline. If I wanted to edit this keyframe, let's say to delete it, or copy it and paste it, all I have to do is right click on it and delete or copy. Alright. So let's say I wanted to copy that keyframe. So I would right click on it, I would copy here, and let's say I want this action to stand for the next 6 frames right here. So I'm just gonna right click on 6 and paste it. Alright, so that means that both of these keyframes are on 0 and 6. Okay. If I wanted to move this keyframe, let's say that I wasn't sure about the position of it, the way that I select this keyframe and move it around, it's by holding shift and then left clicking on it. Alright, and you're gonna get this kind of red area, alright, or red highlight, and it's gonna give you a couple of different things that you can do here. The one that I'm going to focus on right now, it's basically the arrows in the center, and these 2 arrows in the center are going to allow you to move your keyframe around. All you got to do is left click on them, hold it, and then just drag. Alright, and that's going to allow you to move your keyframe. Alright, these outside arrows basically allow you to kind of move your animation around, but in a different way. So in order to showcase that, I'm going to select more than one keyframe. So while holding shift, I'm going to select here on 6, and then I'm going to kind of hold the left click and just drag select until 12. Alright, so I just selected this whole area. And again, the middle ones allow you to move everything together. These allow you to kind of uniformly move your keyframes. So for instance, if I was to select this one, and if I take this arrow and move it backwards, alright, now these kind of outside arrows can be a little bit messy. Alright. Now notice that the keyframe selected that I just it's here on yellow. Now the other thing that you should notice about keyframes is that they're usually within the lines. Okay, so notice that this keyframe is no longer at 11 but at a fraction of 11. Alright, so, and if I move the first keyframe right here, notice that this one's going to keep moving within the fraction of that keyframe and not necessarily the frame itself. So this kind of range selection can be a little bit messy. I would recommend not to use it unless you have to, but just know that you have that option. Alright. Alright, so so we copied and pasted this keyframe, so that means that it's going to be selecting this, it's going to be keeping this pose for about 6 frames. Then it's going to kind of jump up and be in the air at this point, and then at 24 it's going to land. Okay, and again, if we play this animation, it's going to look a little bit weird there. So I actually want this I want the sphere to kind of be in the air just for 12 frames. And again, this just kind of all depends on the timing that you want. So I'm just gonna come here, left click, hold shift, left click. I'm just gonna copy, and again I didn't need to do it to select it. I could just select that frame specifically, right click and copy that. And I'm gonna go to frame 18, that's 6 frames. I'm gonna paste this. Okay, so that's gonna hold that position all that time. Alright, all those 6 frames. So my whole animation is gonna look more like this. Okay, so within this 6 frames that I have right here, I want to create a little bit of anticipation, then follow through with the animation that I'm just kind of creating here. Okay, and again, keep in mind that I've already set a couple keyframes here. Some of them are just copies of other ones, and I have my AutoKey selected. So at this point, any changes that I create on my timeline or on my object itself is going to automatically set a keyframe for me. If you don't want this to happen, if you want to do it manually, make sure you have this off. Alright? So, I want it to start kind of at default. Alright? And by frame 6 I want to do a couple of things. Maybe at frame 3 I wanted to maybe kind of move back a little bit, and then kind of squash, and then at 6 is going to move forward and then stretch a little bit. By 12 it's probably going to be, you know, like this, and then as it lands it's going to be kind of stretched out and then kind of squish a little bit and then go back to default position. So let's see if we can do all those things within what we have right here. So again, at 3 I'm going to squish. But another thing that I need to keep in mind before I do anything is that, like mentioned before, the position of our pivot is very important when it comes to animation. So if I wanted to squish this ball to make it look like an actual ball would squish as it's on the ground, if I try to scale it from the center of the object, it's not going to do what I want it to do, because it's going to be scaling from the center and not from the ground. Alright, so again, basically changing the position of our pivot is something that's really important when it comes to animation. So in order to change the position, in order to affect the pivot itself, just hold D. Alright, and that's going to allow you to pretty much place the pivot whatever you want. If I want it to be at the bottom of my sphere here, I'm going to be using some of my snapping tools to be able to accomplish that. So I'm going to turn on the snapping tool for vertices, okay? And I'm basically just going to move my pivot down until it actually hits the vertex at the bottom of my sphere, okay? Then I'm going to let go of D. I'm going to turn off my snapping. Alright, let me go back to my perspective. Alright, and now if I select my object, notice that my pivot, it's going to be at the bottom, and if I scale on the Y, it's no longer going to do it from the center but from the bottom of the object. Okay, so again, the location of the pivot when it comes to animation is very important. Alright, so at first the scale is at 0, then I move to 3, it's going to scale down. Then at this point I probably want it to stretch a little bit. Okay, let's do like 1.5. Okay, then at this point I probably want it to be at 0. Now the reason why it's not going back to 0 is because this was a keyframe that we set up with AutoKey. So as I mentioned before, when I'm using the AutoKey, it's only going to set the keyframes on whatever I'm making the changes at the time. So when I set this keyframe, I only moved my object on the y-axis. So it only set up the keyframe for that y-axis, but everything stayed pretty much it didn't stay the same, it just didn't set a keyframe for everything else at 12. So if I want this object to be at default at this point, I need to do it myself. I just have to come here and press 1. Alright, so it'll look something like this, and then when it lands, we probably want it to maybe stretch a little bit. Okay. Now this doesn't have to be perfect. I'm just trying to go through some of the basic kind of principles of animation here and how you kind of go about setting some of those keyframes. Alright. If you're wondering how I'm kind of adding things by not clicking on this, I'm selecting the specific channel and I'm just middle mouse clicking here. Alright, but it's not doing what I want it to do, so I'm just going to go in here and type it myself. Alright, and then it's kind of back at 0 there. Alright, so so the scaling is looking pretty good, but I feel like I can add a little bit more interest to my animation if I add a little bit of maybe follow through before it actually jumps out. Alright. So again, remember that the location of our pivot is really important. Right now, the pivot of our object is at the bottom, so any scaling that we do is kind of coming from there. Any rotation that we do from this point on, it's also going to come from the bottom. So at this point, it's going to be at everything at 0. When it comes to 3 and it's doing the squash, I might want to maybe rotate it back a little bit. Okay, so notice it's rotating right from the bottom. Okay, and at this point at 6, stretching out to jump, probably wanted to kind of kneel forward. Okay, and again, remember that these changes are being made automatically for me without having to set a keyframe by pressing S to each one because I have my AutoKey on. So make sure that again, you're aware that if you don't have your AutoKey on, these changes you're gonna have to do by pressing S every time. And then at this point, it's just gonna go up. Okay. And if I want the rotation of the object to maybe be at its default 0 here, I would just gonna have to change that myself. Alright, maybe we can add a little bit of scale here on the Y, maybe squash down a bit. And then, when he lands here, the rotation kind of needs to look like he landed coming from this direction. Alright, and adding a little bit of follow through, so I'm just going to rotate it forward a bit. And then it's just going to move back. Okay. And again, maybe I can kind of come here and move this up a little bit. And we just created again, very basic animation by setting a couple keyframes here on our timeline. We learned how to set up keyframes by clicking the shortcut S. In specific points in our timeline. We also covered the concept of the AutoKey. We looked into the playback options here. We used a little bit of the time slide, and before we did anything, we went into our preferences and set up our file to for it to be able to play to create our animation at 24 frames per second, and then to play it back at real time 24 frames per second. Okay, so again, these are just some basics. We're going to be covering more of this as we create the main mechanical arm project. Okay, so more on different basic ways to create animation in Maya coming your way. Thank you for watching.